Thomson, Dr. Kathy Baxter, who will also be presenting today, Michelle Magnuson from Student Accessibility Services, our research assistant, Nikki Brasser, and Sherry Dick from the Department of Psychiatric Nursing, Winnipeg campus. I also want to acknowledge an important team member, Morgana Malian, who was involved in the conceptualization of the project. And that funding was provided by Brandon University Research Committee. It's important to acknowledge that Brandon University has campuses on both Treaty 1 and Treaty 2 lands, and Kathy and I are both joining from Treaty 1 and or Treaty 2 lands today. So we want to acknowledge the shared territory of the Dakota, Iwate, Anishinaabe, and the national homeland of the Red River Métis. Today, many other Indigenous people call Winnipeg and Brandon their home, and acknowledging others as well, including the plants, animals, and peoples who share their history, traditions, and on the land and water. We are grateful to gather on these lands today. So our study focused on the experience of disability and the stories of those who experience disability. The definition of disability we used from this study was derived from the Accessible Canada Act. The purpose of this act is to identify, remove, and address barriers regarding accessibility in Canada. The term used refers to any impairment, including physical, mental, intellectual, cognitive, learning, communication, or sensory impairment, or another type of limitation, whether that's permanent, temporary, or episodic in nature, evident or not, that impacts a person's full and equal participation in society. So a disability under this definition also includes environmental challenges, such as the experience of stigma and issues with accessibility. There are different models of disability. So disability has been viewed and understood in many different ways. Often it's viewed under the lens of the medical model. And under this model, disability is considered an individual impairment, illness, injury, ailment, or inability. It's also found that the medical model contributes to experiences of stigma and discrimination. So an alternative to the medical model that's been proposed is the social model of disability. The social model places more importance on barriers that limit or prevent full participation within society. So under this model, it looks at societal practices and norms that exclude or oppress groups of people rather than individual impairments. And according to this model, environments should be adapted to reduce barriers and improve access. So the research team is more aligned with the social model. In nursing education, or academic institutions across Canada have reported an increase in students who identify with a disability, such as a learning disorder or mental health disorder, while the number of students with physical or sensory disabilities has remained relatively unchanged within the past 30 years. This statistic is the most recent that we could find for academic institutions. It comes from the National Education Association of Students with Disabilities. We have legislation and policy in place that obligates that academic institutions remove barriers for those who experience disabilities, including students with disabilities, to better facilitate learning through inclusive practices and through the use of reasonable accommodations. However, in general, students with disabilities have reported issues with access and sometimes reduced learning opportunities. Educators, on the other hand, have reported often uncertainty regarding the specific ways to support students who experience disabilities. And despite good intentions, many nurse instructors have struggled to promote inclusive environments in nursing education, especially when it comes to clinical practice. So we've engaged in narrative inquiry. The purpose of the study was to identify strategies that will assist nursing and psychiatric nursing students who experience disabilities in classroom, laboratory, and clinical practice settings. We wanted to understand barriers that may impede learning or skill acquisition. So in this study, we had a research assistant complete recruitment, data collection, and member check because it did involve students and members of the research team or academic faculty. The research assistant interviewed nursing or psychiatric nursing students from a program in a Canadian province who self-identified with experiencing a disability at the time of the interview. 4 participants were psychiatric nursing students and 2 participants were nursing students. They were either interviewed in year 3 or year 4 of their studies, and we engaged in recruitment across 3 academic years beginning in 2021. Disclosure of disability was not required to participate in this study. However, participants did choose to share this information with the research assistant. So based on the Government of Canada definition, the types of disabilities disclosed were physical, mental health, and sensory related, and 3 of the 6 participants disclosed more than one type of disability. Data were analyzed according to the approach described by Catherine Collier-Reisman and involved 3 separate stages: transcription, structural analysis, and thematic analysis. The final themes are based on the shared stories and commonalities identified across each story. So what we found was 2 distinct stories emerging from the data, and we're going to share both of those stories with you today. We found that those who had less support found the program to be more challenging, and those who received more support found the program to be less challenging. Regardless of having supports in place, the programs were described as intense, challenging, and demanding. What we're presenting here is composites of the 2 distinct stories. To do the stories justice, myself and Kathy will read verbatim of the composites presented. And I just want you to sort of take some time, remove distractions, close your emails, put down your pen, that sort of thing, so that we can really hear the stories that our participants shared with us. So the first story. I wanted to be a nurse in grade 9 with Take Your Kid to Work Day. I loved it that whole day. And from then I knew I wanted to be a nurse. So I took everything I needed in high school to apply to the nursing program. But it was a really big shift from high school to university, and I struggled to make that transition. When I started school during the pandemic, everything was stressful. School was stressful, but I was also always worried about getting COVID or spreading COVID. So there was just an additional stress of that. With the courses being mostly online, it was easy to not pay attention. The pandemic was worse for me in terms of motivation to do schoolwork, but then that also, the ability to self-motivate got predominantly worse. Online learning hindered communication. We were basically using email to communicate with instructors. I felt silly sending quick questions in an email. I would much rather just stop by an office and ask quickly. And just the sheer numbers of emails going back and forth felt unnecessary. I like people. I like being around people. I like seeing people's faces. So my own mental health and that stir craziness didn't help. Studying and spending all day, every day in my own space, I was getting sick of it. In year 2, I was struggling to keep up with everything. And I spoke to a classmate. They said, say you're suffering, you want to apply for accessibility. But I said, no, I never used that last year. I shouldn't apply now. They said, it doesn't matter. But I was trying to show them I was strong. I didn't want to disclose to instructors that I had a disability. I didn't want to access accessibility services, nor did instructors really talk about it. And I don't really like disclosing it because I feel like people just treat me different. But in my first meeting with accessibility services, I'm pretty sure I started crying. And I said it felt like I was cheating if I had extra time on tests. I guess I just didn't understand I was evening that playing field and it wasn't giving me a leg up. But I had one professor, because class attendance was really bad last year, they said they were going to do pop quizzes. And immediately I'm nervous. I'm like, okay, well, I have an accommodation and I'm supposed to write tests in a quiet place and have more time. The instructor stated your accommodations don't really matter. If you can't do this test without an accommodation, then you can't be a nurse. I had to write the quiz in class, and the first one, it was only a few questions, so I felt stupid even making a big deal. But they started handing out the quiz at one end of the classroom, and those students were quick. People would finish, they would start walking up, and here I was trying to pay attention, but people were walking by to hand in their tests, and then they're talking with the instructor, and the instructor's talking with them. Basically, the whole room is talking, and I'm still trying to look at the first question, but I can't focus on it. It always just took extra time to try and get supports. Often the mental energy of it just wasn't worth it for me. And even trying to access resources, there are a multitude of different types of problems. I had an accommodation to have slides at least 24 hours in advance, so I could upload the slides into Glean, which it takes a while. But there are a few professors who made changes last minute and then things didn't really match up. And I told them that the slides were different and it made it really difficult to follow. And they responded by saying they regularly update their slides, even right before class, and that they didn't really have to provide slides for us. So basically, I felt like they were sort of telling me to suck it up and that they were just doing us a favor by giving us slides at all. I felt like I was very much needing to constantly swim against the current whenever I tried to address these things. Some people were really good about it, but other times I needed to advocate for myself and for disability support measures. I did reach out to accessibility services about getting accommodations for clinical this year, but it was met with, well, do you really need that? You haven't used it before. And I said, I didn't even know it existed before, but accessibility services was like, well, it does exist, but it would be good practice for the workplace to go without them. It was very discouraging because it was discouraging how difficult it was to get any clinical accommodations. I didn't initially know it was an option, and that's why it had never been discussed before. Also in lab, we were told if we can't perform a task without accommodation, then how are we ever going to work? While I can understand where they're coming from with that logic, test anxiety doesn't apply for doing tasks at work, for me and for others. Again, year 2 was a really difficult year with our clinicals and everything. We were also in more than full-time classes. The advisor had to approve or override things because there were more classes than you're supposed to register for, and it was definitely overwhelming. I said to my instructor, I can't stay on top of all this content, and is there any way you can let us know how to prioritize? They responded to tell me the amount of time you're supposed to spend studying per credit hours. So I did the calculations, and it was about 10 hours a day, 7 days a week that we're supposed to be spending only on school. I replied to them that I understand this might be the expectation, but is it reasonable? I don't even think it's reasonable for people who don't have a disability. I think it's unreasonable for anyone. But for people like me that have accommodations for a disability, it takes us a lot longer. And in my first clinical, that unit, it was really busy. So we're charting, my instructor's constantly talking to me about how I need to get a bit faster at it. I wasn't in trouble or anything, but it was just something that always came up. I was trying to write notes in a room where there's 10 other people that are talking and doing their own stuff. Different nurses and doctors were coming in and out. I feel like it would have been really great to have an accommodation to document in a quiet space. There's been times throughout the program where I've experienced stigma and that faculty don't really know how to deal or address it. I remember one class sitting there fidgeting, trying to pay attention, and I was called out for being disinterested. It felt like disability was bad or undesirable. And in our class, a high number of people experience mental illness and disability. So I'm sitting there knowing that other people are also impacted by this statement. They said, you're going to have to face stigma about mental illness and disability in the workforce, so you need to learn how to deal with these comments now. I mean, I can sit at work and have a conversation totally calm about these things. The difference here is that if you don't stop stigma, then you're essentially teaching people it's okay to have these ideas. and take them into the workplace. There are even certain labs where I remember students being penalized for not making eye contact, but they expressed that they had sensory issues. It was like the instructor didn't really understand the concept of that disability. And they would say, okay, girls, but one of our students was non-binary. And even though we said it multiple times, please don't address us as girls, they would do it anyways. Because of these experiences, I would say I almost stigmatize myself. I'm very self-conscious and very unsure of myself, which is a lot harder when you have a disability. Throughout the program, I was trying to set myself up for success. But I was also trying to manage on top of the workload that everyone else was working on. I was always trying to keep up with students, but that also felt like an extra responsibility of bettering myself and preparing myself for the future. I must do extra things all the time to set myself up for that success. And I made it through the program. I was determined to get what I want, and I didn't look at a disability as something that should or could hold me back for what I have a passion for. So I share these additional kinds of experiences because if anyone comes around, especially other students, it will motivate them to keep going, to not give up, to feel like they can't achieve this. This is achievable. No matter who you are, no matter the situation you find yourself in, if you have a disability, one way or another, you can still achieve it.
So I'm going to begin now with story number 2, and this is the story of having more supports through the program. Growing up, I noticed my passion towards caring for others. I've always found health and mental health intriguing, and I'm interested in the intangible and subjective nature of mental health. So I started working with people as a support worker with individuals that have mental health challenges. I'm glad I did that because it gave me insight about what I want to do, to care for people and to understand what's going on with them. That's why I decided to go into nursing, because I wanted to learn more about care. I wanted to provide the support they need to help them recover and move forward from what they have experienced so they can work on improving their health and mental health. I started university during the pandemic. When I heard classes would be online, I felt like it was going to be more difficult and I was kind of upset about it. But then I realized it was actually a lot nicer, especially with my disabilities. I guess I would say they were easier to accommodate because I was at home. If I was particularly fatigued, it's not like I would have to get up and drive across town and maybe walk 3 blocks because I can't find parking. If I'm in pain, I can keep my camera off, get up, stretch, and not be worried that people might be looking at me. Being online was actually a blessing in disguise. And if I missed things or lost focus, I could go back if the lecture was recorded. Being in my own space, I had control over my environment and the different sensory things. I could have the lights down, or I could have music in the background, or I could have been completely quiet. I was in control of the environment, and it was really helpful for me. In pre-nursing, I didn't have a diagnosis or anything like that. I coasted through high school and managed to come up fine and do everything on time. But I struggled in pre-nursing year, in anatomy and physiology. I think I had a bit of a breakdown twice, and I thought I just couldn't do it anymore. It was really tough. I consulted my mom, and she said I need help. I don't know what to do. My doctors were not really doing anything for me at that time, and I thought nursing just wasn't for me at that point. So I withdrew from anatomy and physiology and focused on first-year writing classes. I wasn't doing so good, like B+ and C+ type of thing. And I know grades aren't everything. But then A&P came along. The first month or two, it was okay, and I was managing well enough. But as the work piled on, it just got really overwhelming. I pretty much failed the first term, which was very, very discouraging. I was doing poorly and struggling. I felt like a failure. It felt awful. I just couldn't win. And that's when I had a big breakdown. So I reached out to my mom again, and she took me to the doctor. That was when I started to get treatment and take medication. There were, however, still some things in school that I was struggling with. I was talking to the doctor, and she asked what kind of accommodations I had. And I was like, "What do you mean?" And she was like, "You have to talk to your school about it and tell them." And I was like, "Oh." So then I got into accessibility services. They just accepted me and said, "Sounds like you would benefit from." I think it was the classic time and a half on exams and a quiet space to write. That was how it started. Fast forward to the next semester when I had the accommodations, I had more time and the software that can read the textbook to me, and my grade on the next test was like 96 or something. My grades basically doubled, and my performance improved with accommodations. I didn't even realize that it would be a good option, but once I started having them, it was like, this is probably something I needed to be doing all along. Once I did get the accommodations, that was a huge weight off my chest. I wish I would have known about it earlier when I tried pre-nursing the first time, and I was really struggling. I was able to have time and a half on exams and a quiet space to write. I used Glean software to record lectures so I could flag things. I found it rather life-saving, especially during the pandemic, during online school, just so I can look back and I could pay attention to the lecture. Unfortunately, senior practicum started off real rough. I got COVID right before I was supposed to start, so I was quite sick for a week. But then I still had COVID brain fog on top of everything else. At some point, when I was speaking to my faculty advisor, I did admit that I was struggling even a month later, physically and mentally. They were really good about it, saying that if I need to make up the shifts, to just add them on to the end, and don't try squeezing them into 1 week or only having like one day off on the weekend just to avoid overexerting myself. Eventually, though, I needed to speak with accessibility services. I was physically struggling, just kind of in general with practicum. I ended up sleeping on the floor during lunch one time. I was exhausted, and I was really worried that it would reflect poorly on me. I was just physically unable to do everything. My faculty advisor told me to reach out to accessibility services again, and it was nice to receive accommodations for practicum. We had decided that just giving me the chance to have extra breaks if I need, like just having that as a kind of like safety net made me feel better. I was able to be open with my preceptor and peers, and being open really helped. Overall, the nursing program was so challenging because you want to get a high GPA all the time, but especially to get into the program. During those years, you also suffer. I found that math and anatomy were both very hard subjects for me. Year 2, everything got more serious and it became very, very intense workload. And I found it difficult to manage both class and clinical at the same time because I was physically exhausted and I needed that time to recuperate. Practicum has its own homework and preparation, and I can't sleep when I'm on practicum. I think that's a common thing amongst students, actually, is that we just can't sleep the night before. I remember once I was struggling finishing up the write-up for an assignment. I needed to sleep. I knew my blood pressure might be high and my kids were asleep, so this is the only time I could do it and get it out of the way. Tomorrow I need to be at clinical in the morning. So I called a classmate and I remember what they told me. Stop being so hard on yourself. Just get some sleep. Even if the faculty member has to deduct some marks, that's okay. You need to take care of yourself first. That really sunk in. Why am I killing myself? I slept a while and in the morning went to a clinical. I came back, I finished the assignment, and I submitted it. Once I had accommodations, it was smoother sailing. I would say that most of the staff have all been great. That was always something. that they've made it a lot easier having a disability. They've been supportive in that sense. Overall, I've just felt immense support and understanding. I needed those words of encouragement. I needed the support. I needed the reassurance. I needed to feel like, yeah, someone is there for me, and it really helped. But there were a couple of instructors that almost convinced me to feel that because I had a disability, it was always going to be harder for me to do this job. But I don't feel that it will in practice. I felt like it was very stigmatizing, and we should be, out of all professions, the best at not doing that. Even when I had accommodations, I didn't want to use them. Like if I had to take extra breaks during practicum, I would feel guilty or kind of sneaky if they didn't know why I was getting that kind of special treatment. I'm doing senior practicum right now, and I'm exactly where I want to be, where I need to be, which is inpatient care. I'm up to a full patient load. I've been there about a month. I'm doing well and providing good care. I think it also helps me to feel better about needing supports and to raise that awareness and make others realize that having a disability doesn't necessarily mean that you can't do anything. Hopefully, it encourages other people to be more open about their struggles and seek help when they need it. I can manage with my disability now, but people often forget I have one. Not in a bad way, if that makes sense. I almost appreciate it. So the two differing stories that emerged shine a light on the need to remove barriers for nursing students who experience disabilities. From the perspective of disability and education perspective, universal design for learning aligns with the social model of disability, where addressing access is regarded as a social responsibility. This approach recognizes that the disability is not the focus, but rather attention is on the removal of socially and environmentally imposed access barriers. This includes barriers related to policy, written text, spoken communication, and the built environment, all of which can be found in education settings. The barriers here were a reluctance to engage in self-disclosure, two reasons, stigma and discrimination, and participants being unsure of what supports were available, in particular relating to clinical supports. Some issues accessing accommodations that when they were in place, and stigma and discrimination as an attitude barrier as well. The heavy workload of students should also be considered. In particular, in this research, it was the second year of the program that was noted to be most difficult. The stories offer suggestions of ways to improve accessibility and reduce the need for individual accommodations. Things like recording class lectures for everyone, providing class lecture materials 24 hours in advance for everyone, collaborate with students and accessibility service professionals regarding reasonable accommodations, and establishing and communicating a process for declining accommodations in the form of policy. Finally, administrators must provide resources to educators to ensure that accessibility can be easily accommodated. For example, providing technology to record and upload lectures. And that brings us to the end of the presentation. If you would like any more information, the research has recently been published, and that is the reference for the publication. So that leads us to our final slides of references and opens it up to questions.